In the large aesthetics palette of the Western civilization in classical music, from before medieval into Renaissance, Baroque, classical, romantic, and mostly early modern, until the atonality, you can find a lot of options for expression that would be considered interpretation, enhancing or over enhancing the text itself, which is the notation translating the thought process of the writing of a composer who left us a manuscript, a published edition, or copied by other scholars or students through the times, and which reaches us out of the context of its time with our own ears, our own aesthetics of the day, our own capacity of concentration or acceptance of decisions that are made based on intuition compared to knowledge because of the enhanced amount of school offerings compared to even the 19th century in many continents and on many places in the world where other cultures go to this culture of the Western European, as well as sometimes, but not as often as it should be. While I think it's fantastic when it happens, people going to the, let's say, Eastern or other hemispheres, southern ones, of their traditional music, and therefore their aesthetics, their philosophy, basically their civilization, past, present, or its evolution. Naturally, teaching is the precision, but music is not necessarily notated as a precise science. A lot is left to the performer, either in the context of the expectation in the time when it was written and when it was played by people who played the music of this time, which meant that this ecosystem was relatively closed in time and space. People lived not very long, didn't travel far. The few who did were real cross pollinators, which is incredibly important because they brought in this capacity for the receptive musicians in the areas where they lived to discover music when they wouldn't have by their own the capacity to do so because of the traveling restrictions of finances and even language awareness and culture, and basically everybody was relatively living in their own time period. And since little was conserved of the scores, which were frankly lost, and most of them were improvised anyway, in part or entirely. Even Mozart, his own concerti, he rarely wrote the piano part when it was for him. Of course, when it was commissioned or wished by him for somebody, other performers, then of course he did. But and even so, he didn't do everything, and nobody really does notate everything. There is something as over-notating in a certain way by giving overly much indications in a way the music itself, if it's an expression of the intellect, the emotion, and the culture of a time to which we are receptive, even centuries later, talks to us directly, even without the indications, which either reassure us, either puzzle us. When Schumann writes "aus erst bewegt" in the beginning of Kreisteriana, from the get-go very lively, is already an injunction not to do it little by little faster, or assuming that you might intuitively think so. And so sometimes the indications are there to preserve us from, like Ravel writes, ne pas ralentir, don't slow down. Of course, you're not supposed to, but if the music might bring you to, by its texture, context of the genre and the emotion that it vehicles, So, of course, for us objectively as a teacher to be in between the dead composer and the living students' first encounter with the piece, we are sort of hyphens, and I find to say that the choices of interpretational tools for the translation of the text from the heard, read, connected by the neurons and the capacity of the fingers to react to what we heard innerly from reading the score, or misread, not only misguess, of course, the misread is an obvious fact. Is this not and not another one? But sometimes there are little ambiguities between a publisher and another who are not sure of some note that could have been misguessed by the engraver at the time and goes past through time to us. The culture of recitation versus imagination, or therefore retelling, has enhanced with the 20th century's development, exponentially so, of competitions, juries in editions and publications and radio stations, and then after the recordings, now the digital outpour of files that are downloadable or streamable anywhere all the time. It brings us to think that in fact, we are very limited if we are to be convincing in the liberties we could take to enhance the text beyond the notes and the pitches and the rhythms and the vague indications of slower or faster, because the rubato is tasteless to one, tasteful to another, and distasteful as it is to do it at all. So then if we reduce everything to a minimal, let's say, hope to not create any critical feeling in any jury member when you pass an audition competition or even job opening audition, then we tend to stay politically correct in some kind of neutral zone, which is in a way what Henley started after World War II with the concept of the urtext, the original text that now most editions claim on their titles of the page, because in a way it gives us a reassurance that they've done the archaeological job to go through the manuscripts if they are not lost, or subsequent editions, etc. All the musicologists and scholars' work. And many oftentimes the prefaces or the postfaces at the scores book are rarely read by the students, of my experience, when I asked them if they were curious to go into these situations where the publisher says, well, there are some discrepancies between different former editions on this specific note. These details, of course, escape the audience who are there to hear a storytelling. And of course, unless they know the story or they played it, then they are perhaps jury members, then it's different because they hear it more organically. They listen to it with an X-ray ear. And then, of course, they add their own taste on it for the interpretation. And if it matches miraculously, it might not match the other member of the many members of the jury. So one way or the other, we can agree to disagree, to confront our opinions, to have analytical or detailed critical description of a performer compared to another performer in a competition as a jury member, or to do it among colleagues, teachers, and hear the same sonata played by a different person, or even different people hearing the same person played and find almost the opposite to say compared to the liberties, quote unquote, that the performer can take, should or shouldn't, with either intuitive rubato or a ritenuto at the end of a phrase, or how you articulate or subarticulate the articulations, how do you use the pedal compared to the acoustics, because sometimes it covers the intentions of the fingers, and also what is the broadcasting of the piece? Is it intuitively something for a large mass of people gathered together, or is it one to one, through a recording. Therefore, the pianissimo is mezzo pianissimo, and the mezzo forte is not a forte because you don't want to raise the voice artistically or have a operatic laugh, artistic or artificial, but reproducing life through art. And then, of course, the aesthetics of this art form then dictate the choices that you do. And then some people can say, oh, you should handle it with legato with the pedal, or because the pedal lifts all the dampers, it clearly makes a little bit more of blur. Then you would use the fingering as a finger pedal. Then you use substitutions, but then it puts out of stability the hand compared to doing 5/5 or 1/1 when you're out of fingers, because the texture calls for more, and you have to divide your attention to so many parts if it's polyphonic compared to a quartet or an orchestra where you have to assemble as a conductor who doesn't play all the brains into the direction in which you want the piece to go. And here you divide your attention to manage all the elements, and then at the same time to direct yourself with a phrasing, direction, line, phrasing, articulation, breathing, not necessarily physical like singers, wind players, or bow changing directions of the instruments who have a bow, since we don't on the piano, so we have to do it artificially, but in a way transcribing the elements that the music itself in the text is imitative of an aria or a dance, or just a pure intervals organization of polyphonic chasing voices, a fugue from the word chase. And all this can be characterized. You can play a fugue with a different character for the same fugue than another one. Is that pure music or necessarily connected to a mood? This doesn't have to be program music, like the only sonata Beethoven called Lebewohl for the Les Adieux, the farewell. But the Appassionata, the Moonlight, it was by Rellstab, the poet, who named it, and others, because it's evocative. But purely said, it's just pure music, as we call it. Therefore, we don't want to necessarily enhance it with our expression in it. And therefore, if the form can define some of the palette of phrasing, articulation, dynamics, choices for the interpretation, not to mention the pulse and the tempo, there is also the analytical understanding of how the form, for instance, a sonata form for the first Viennese school with the two contrasting themes, perhaps more, sometimes very less contrasting, but generally going through a development where they're combined, more or less developed, and then a recapitulation where they have to be more or less acquiescing into the original tonality, tonalizing, if it was in the relative major in the principal minor key, or if it was a dominant in the principal major key, it will be still in major. But in any case, he has to be tonalized in the original key. But then again, if you play on this very subtle psychological manipulation that mostly Romantic era composers use in the front sonata form, classically due or ode to Haydn, is that if you use the second theme in major because you tonalize it in the mode of the relative major of the exposition, then you end up like in Chopin's second sonata in major, in Tchaikovsky's concerto of B-flat minor in major, the first movement, and therefore there the major becomes the hope compared to the minor, which is despair. That of course is not very subtle to describe it. It's more subtle than that, because in the minor you have ascending minor with the top tetrachord major, and then on the descending minor the natural without the leading tone, the flat seven. So you have varieties of subtleties, of shades of romantic expressions of the minor mode. Of course, Baroque already did. We call it Baroque, of course they didn't, but Bach does all the time. These combinations or grinding combinations of dissonances already in the motets of Thales, where you have the flat seven and the sharp seven of the leading tone combined together before they become unison on the dominant for dubbing of the voice leading in the harmonic progressions of the 18th century. But all this awareness, the pianist who performs should have a knowledge that if in the past the even portions or projections of improvisations were part of the tools of the interpretation, where the composer expected the performer to change the decorative patterns, not only to add an ornament, but possibly both, not necessarily modulate in another key in the development than the one he chose, because there is a, after all, GPS mapping of the piece that we're supposed to play, and not to divert from. But if you don't think outside of the box in order to play better what is inside the box, then I feel like one remains a bit unaware of this, because you have to exponentially expand the horizons of the student culturally, historically, contextually, and perhaps define stylistically what would have or not be done as a modulation at that time, with examples of other works of the same composer in quartets, in operas, in symphonies, and not necessarily only their piano output. But why not? You can always surprise and consider that out of context. You can rethink and say, "Oh, I would like to improvise a section of it because that's what I would like to do with today's musical language and superimpose it to theirs." Now, you could always argue, my teacher used to say, if you don't like it the way it's written, write your own. And I would say that is a very healthy thing. If everybody was a composer, in necessarily not written, perhaps even just improvised, then everybody will feel more free to express themselves. But that doesn't take us away from respecting the text that we receive, and the teachers are here to enforce that, not only the publishers and the competitions and the schools and the exams and the juries and the recordings. But then there is this spark that makes you say, "Oh, that's why I want to write this." And perhaps you don't write it, you just make it up every time differently. It can be a little detail. You can change the direction of a phrasing or direction of a line or a pulse, the upbeat and the downbeat. Every element of the expression can be part of the aesthetic tools for interpretation. The pulse, the phrasing, the articulation, the quality of the legato, the cultivated knowledge of what you want to do in terms of the melodic layering of the polyphony, or the harmonic structure, or the offbeat harmonic structure, and how you don't want to smear the harmonies over the others with pedaling on the beats, but just after, or not at all. And then you have to have fingerings that apply to it, or perhaps there are sometimes displays that are way too large for us to play, because people like Rachmaninoff, Scriabin, Mettner wrote for hands that are larger than either theirs, but not necessarily, but not thinking of ours. And so the teacher's place, of course, that's what I consider it to be the case, is here to bring solutions, how to handle it, not necessarily to betray it compared to the notation and saying, Prokofiev wanted a crossed hand, but then you lose the held chord compared to the staccato, and then it's more artistically interesting to cross the hand. If you hold this and you play the staccato and then you just play this instead of crossing, at least you have all the text. But then even Prokofiev writes pedal over staccato, then does it mean that the staccato is wet? Or do you want to implement it? And if you can have the middle pedal, which most pianists, composers of the past didn't, if not used, didn't indicate in the score. Or then you played still with the pedal that they had, which is the right foot mostly, only. And you accept a certain blur, or you prefer a certain way of displaying it that allows it to be displayed. And all that matters is that the listeners don't have the score. They don't know the scenario. They haven't read the book of the adaptation that you propose to give them when you play. It's not like reading a book to unalphabetized audience who just expect that the way you will engage them in the book by the way you tell it, which is what theater play actors do. But when you know the piece or the play or the text, so either because you're professional, either because you're an amateur who compares them just by knowing them because it's something that is dear to you, then you become critical and you have the capacity subtly to appreciate somebody using this or that tool to enhance the text here or there compared to another. And it's not necessarily better or worse, or you can say I like it, I don't, but of course today we have so many recordings, we can compare them, we can hear them, click, 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 and then it's only the visible part of the iceberg. Why did they get to that point intuitively or analytically in order to play it or deliver it that way? And sometimes contradictory differently, they recorded it later because somehow the piece lives through your life, and if you have a chance to live long enough, you rediscover it differently, of course through teaching. That is all teachers would tell you, of course, but also through playing it yourself at different seasons of your life, which is so incredibly humbling, touching, moving, and meaningful that it can mean so much at all seasons of one's life, from childhood to old age, if we have the chance to get there, and in what shape. And so we receive a lot, we translate, we transmit. We hope to not be losing ourselves in translation. And then ultimately, we let be the music itself, in between the lines of the notation, bring us to this escapism of this other world where we associate it to where we want it to be in our imagination, just like when you read a fiction or a biography of somebody or about somebody, and these characters become then, it's marvelous. It could become then everybody should play their own sonata, not necessarily the sonata of the other adapted by them, but there is a margin of interpretation where you are not the recomposer, and there is a possibility to be the composer. And if you don't want, then you have to accept it that you could be also the improviser in part of it. And if you want to be just and consistently the most respectful, in fact, recitant of it, then you'll be also very convincing, as long as what you do is what corresponds to your conviction from what you have received or you have perceived, and then you have filtered through your critical understanding, and then you deliver it on that moment with your conviction, and then you become involved and you become believable, and you can contradict yourself in the future from the past eventually, from the way you approach it, or perhaps some other element of literature, life, history, basically even revisiting the manuscript brings you to rethink how you're going to constantly try to better the way you will express it, and therefore transmit it to the students, so you give them the tools for their own interpretations, not to be the clones of yours, as evolving as possible. That is necessarily a big undertaking, because it's easier to say play like me, or that's imitation, and imitation is part of the learning, but the learning is what it comes when it becomes yours, and you pick and choose as a student from what you receive, and then you make it your own. It's a slow, progressive construction of cultivation.